So I'm really not even certain how I would describe my video for you tonight. I do, however, know that it's one that has many moving parts and an incredible plot twist. I can assure you that there will be a divide as to how you all feel about this case, so just know that I respect all of your opinions and feelings. This case takes place in Wichita, Kansas, on a really hot afternoon in 1977. A man named Edward Finley, he had been building a backyard patio earlier in the day, and he was resting inside of his house when he suddenly collapsed. Edward's wife, Ruth, was sitting next to him on the couch, and she tried to revive him, and when she couldn't, she called 911. 25 minutes later, Ed was in the emergency room, where he recovered consciousness, and he spent the rest of the day getting testing done. Both Edward and Ruth had assumed that Edward had suffered a heart attack from all of the strain of building the deck earlier in the day. But although they thought it was a heart attack, the doctors were not finding any evidence of that, so Edward was admitted to hospital for further testing. Ruth was 47 years old at the time, and she worked as a secretary at Southwestern Bell Telephone Company. And Edward, he was an accountant of a small construction firm, and he was 49 years old. So the Finleys, Ruth and Ed, they were a couple that were pretty concerned about how they were perceived by other people, but it was more in the sense of them wanting to be known as unassuming people without any kind of pretense or any kind of drama in their lives. They weren't the kind of people who like to be noticed for anything other than, I guess I would say, being modest. So really kind of like a no-frills couple, if that makes any sense. Both Ruth and Ed were from the Midwest. Ruth was born on a farm in Missouri, and she lived at home until she was 16 years old when she moved to Fort Scott, Kansas, which was really not too far from where she had originally lived. The high school in Fort Scott, where she moved to, was larger than the one she formerly attended, and she was able to take some classes that her former high school did not offer. While she was going to school, she also got a job part-time working for the phone company. So this place where Ruth was living, it was like an apartment house, and she lived there on her own. It was like, I think if you would think of a rooming house, where you have your own room, but then there are common areas that you share. It was pretty much something like that, and the reason why she lived there by herself is because it was closer to her high school that she wanted to go to, and so her parents had agreed that she could go there, provided, she kept good grades and that she got a part-time job in order to pay for it, which is what she did. So a few years later, Ruth met Ed, and Ed was attending a junior college after he had done some time in the Navy. Ruth and Ed dated for some time, and they married on June 1st, 1950. And from there, they moved to Wichita, Kansas, where Ed got a job at Beach Aircraft, and Ruth worked for the phone company in a different position, and she stayed there for 2 years before taking time off a sister named Jean, who was 4 years younger. Both of her siblings were married and lived in Wichita, and she had 5 nieces and nephews. After coming home that night, after Ed was admitted to hospital, it was still pretty hot out, and Ruth turned up the air conditioning and went down to the basement. It's a lot cooler down there, and she made some telephone calls to let people know that Ed was in hospital. After she made her phone calls, she turns on the TV, and there was a news special being televised about Wichita's first serial killer, the BTK strangler. Now, I assume most of you know who BTK is, but if you don't, he is a serial killer in Wichita, Kansas, and, well, I guess we can talk about BTK another time, because he's a whole other animal. BTK means bind, torture, kill, which is what he had done to his now 7th victim of Wichita's east side where Ruth and Ed lived. Ruth was a little put off by this special event that she was watching. Kind of creeped her out a little bit, so she decided that she's going to turn on some music to get her mind off of it, and then she heads off to bed. So as she's walking up the stairs, it is now 10:30 p.m. The phone rings. Now, nobody had ever called her that late, so automatically Ruth thinks that it has to be a hospital. So she rushes to answer it, and when she did, there was a man on the other end of the phone who asked her, "Is this Ruth Smock from Fort Scott, Kansas?" Smock was Ruth's maiden name, so Ruth just assumed that this person must be somebody she knows or she was acquainted with, because they were asking for her by her maiden name. So Ruth says, yes, this is she. So this man then asks her several personal questions about her past, but particularly about the apartment house that she had lived in when she was 16 years old. So at this point, Ruth got pretty agitated, but she also did not want to be rude. So she was answering this guy's questions, but she was being very vague, and that seemed to really be a place of contention for this caller, because it did not sit well with him. And so he tells her, after she's being all vague and all, he tells her, "I know all about that night." Then he starts to read an article from a 1946 edition of a newspaper called the Fort Scott Tribune. And here's what the article said. "Branded on both thighs by a hot flat iron apparently used by a sex maniac, Ruth Smock, 16-year-old Fort Scott High School girl and part-time employee at the local exchange of the Bell Telephone Company, was resting today at the home of her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Carl Smock of Richards, following an attack upon her early last night by a man whom Fort Scott police called a sex maniac. Miss Smock said the intruder placed a bottle under her nose, and she failed to recollect any other happening of the evening until she regained consciousness and found herself lying on the kitchen floor with blood oozing from one leg. She faintly remembers seeing the men heating flat irons on the stove." So that was the article that this man read to Ruth. So Ruth was thinking, why would anybody care about something that happened to her so long ago? She was traumatized for a bit, but she no longer even she felt that she was completely unaffected by it any longer at this point in her life. So this caller then tells her that he works for a construction company, and when they were tearing down some walls, he ended up finding some old newspapers that had pretty embarrassing stories about 3 different people, and he tells Ruth that he's calling all 3 of those people to extort them for money. Or else, if they didn't give him money, he was going to start telling people about these stories. He told Ruth that he wanted money from her, and if she does not agree, that he knows where she works, and he's going to leave the article with her coworkers. Ruth's reaction to this was just hang up, and she ends the phone call. She was shaken a bit, but she did end up falling asleep that night, sleeping for 10 hours. The next morning, she got up and she drove over to hospital. Ed was doing really well. He was sitting up in his bed, and it turns out that Ed had just re-injured himself from a car accident that he had had the previous Christmas Eve. So, when he was working on the patio the day before, the injury was so painful that Ed had passed out from it. Even though Ed was given a clean bill of health, doctors wanted him to stay for a few more nights in hospital for observation, and this was really unsettling for Ruth because ever since her sons had moved out of the house, it was only she and Ed every night, and Ruth had never spent a night alone in the house until the night prior. So now she was having to be alone for a few more nights, and she was pretty worried about it, mostly because of that phone call she got the night before. But she did not tell Ed about it because she really did not want him to worry about it while he was in hospital. However, thankfully, the caller doesn't call back, and once Ed came home, Ruth just tried to forget about the whole incident. A little less than 1 month later, Ruth was at work and she was sorting some mail. This was part of her usual duties, and the mail was mostly always for her boss. However, on this particular day, there was a brown envelope with her name written on it. It was in a really kind of a messy, it almost looked like child writing. The envelope had nothing but her name on it. It had no room number, no address, so she really was not sure how it got there. When she opened it, the article from when she was assaulted that the caller had told her he had was inside. She had not seen it since she was 16 years old, so now here she is, holding this yellow kind of tattered newspaper clipping all about that night. So Ruth's reaction was to just shred it and throw it in the trash. And then after she did that, she tried to focus back on work. But she was having a hard time with it because she had a terrible headache. She had suffered from headaches that seemed to pop out of nowhere all of her life. And she never told Ed about these headaches, and she did not tell Ed about the letter either. She had been taught her entire life that personal problems were best kept private. Over the next few months, Ruth received 6 more calls, and each time she hung up before the caller could say anything other than her name. During that same period, Ed also answered the phone several times, but he only heard the dial tone. So Ed just chalked it up to, it's just a bunch of kids making prank calls, and Ruth never corrected him. Both Ruth and Ed worked downtown, which was the city's center, the heart of the city, so to speak. Their schedules for work were pretty much the same, with Ed getting out of work one half of 1 hour later than Ruth, so they could drive to and from work together to save on gas, and it worked out pretty well for them. Very close to where they worked were some large department stores, and since Ruth got off from work earlier than Ed, she spent her time walking downtown, window shopping quite a lot. One day after work, Ruth was walking downtown, and suddenly a man appears out of nowhere, walking beside her. He starts telling her that she's doing a really good job at work that week, and he tells her she can take the weekend off. But Ruth has no idea who this person is, and he was making statements about how pictures capture who a person really is. Just these really odd ramblings. This man was keeping a consistent pace with Ruth, so she stops walking, kind of to, pretend like she's checking something out in the window, hoping that he would just keep on walking, which he does. But then he realizes what she did, and he's no longer walking with her, and that really made this guy seem pretty mad. So he walks back up to Ruth and Ruth tells him that she's waiting for her husband, hoping he'd go away. And then he just tells her, "I'll remember your face," and then he left. This time around, Ruth was afraid enough to mention the incident to Ed, but Ed told her not to worry about it, that it was just some guy trying to get a date. And Ruth wondered if that guy was the same one who had been calling her, who was, harassing her. Now, 1 year passes. It is July of 1978. Ruth had not heard from this man in all this time. But then one day, on her lunch hour, she was window shopping, and she passes an alley, and she sees this man again. He grabbed Ruth by the wrist and calls her a stupid bitch. Ruth was able to break free from him, and she ran across the street to a Macy's, and she took an escalator to the top, and she finds a payphone, and she calls her husband Ed and tells him to pick her up because she was just assaulted. Ed was really upset and decided right there that they need to go to the police, but Ruth did not want to. She said she just wanted to go home. So Ed took her home, and then he ended up going to the police station on his own, where he spoke with an officer who took down all of the information. However, neither Ruth nor Ed heard from this officer again. 3 months later, on a fall weekend, Ruth was in the kitchen. She was making pies, and she hears the mailman. So when she went to get the mail, there was an envelope with Ruth's name printed on it in large block letters, and when she opened it, it said, "Fuck you, fuck the police, fuck the telephone company." The writer demanded money from her and threatened to hurt her if she did not comply. Ed was out doing errands, but as soon as he got home, she showed him the letter, and Ed thought, this is pretty bad enough to go to the police again. The next day, during their lunch hour, Ruth and Ed went to the police department, and they were directed by the receptionist to the 5th floor to speak with Lieutenant Drowatsky. Ruth and Ed really did not understand why they were being pointed to the Major Crimes Division, but they guessed that it was because their complaint had some similarities to the case of the BTK strangler, who was also writing letters. The BTK strangler had made his first appearance small Wichita house belonging to a mechanic named Joseph Otero. All four members of the family at home that morning, Joseph, his wife, Julie, and two of their 5 children, were strangled. 11-year-old Josephine was also tortured. BTK gagged her, took her to the basement, cut off her bra, and pulled her panties down around her legs. He next placed a rope around the girl's neck and hanged her until she almost choked. Then he relieved the pressure and allowed her to breathe before hanging her again. The police estimated that the man had repeated this as many as 12 times before he finally killed her. He then masturbated into some fabric that he left on site. The police were unable to find any leads nor any motives. All they had was a description from neighbors of a slight, brown-haired stranger seen wandering the area that morning, and their only potential suspects were 2 brothers who were repeated sex crime delinquents. However, an anonymous tip led the police to a letter that was hidden at the Wichita Public Library, in which the writer said he didn't want anyone else to take the credit for his murders. He added, P.S. Since sex criminals do not change their MO by nature, I cannot do so either. I will not change mine. The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. BTK reappeared on March 17, 1977 in the home of 26-year-old Shirley Vian and her 3 pre-teen-aged children. First, he locked the kids in the bathroom, then he strangled their mother and masturbated into her nightclothes. BTK never wore a mask, and the kids saw his face, but psychologists and hypnotists were never able to break through the trauma for a description. The next BTK victim was 25-year-old Nancy Jo Fox on December 8, 1977. Once more, after choking Nancy to death, BTK masturbated into a negligee and laid it by her head. He then sent his second letter to a local news channel in which he described the murders of Shirley Vian and Nancy Jo Fox in detail and claimed that he had killed 7 people, not 6. So the police conjectured that the 7th victim was a 21-year-old college student named Catherine Bright. At that murder, a witness, Catherine's brother Kevin, had been present. However, before he fled, BTK shot Kevin in the head, causing enough brain damage to prevent him from helping the police. BTK never learned the condition of the witness because the police hadn't given that information to the media. BTK also noted the lack of media coverage of his first letter. A little paragraph in the newspaper would have been enough, is what he complained in another letter. A third note was written on a 3x5 index card, and it had a 7-line poem. He added that a poem for Nancy would be next. For the first time in Wichita's history, people locked their door and kept their curtains closed. Ruth, however, had her own situation to describe to Lieutenant Drowatsky. She told him that she had been getting threatening phone calls and that she had been approached on the street twice. She spent about 10 minutes filling forms out and filling him in on everything that had happened. Detectives went over the situation and they concluded that even though there were similarities, they did not think that Ruth received another letter. It said for her to put $100 under the driver's seat in Ed's pickup truck. He warned her that if she told anybody, that he would tell people about her brands and she would get hurt. He kept calling her a dumb bitch and telling her that he knew where she was at all times, and as long as she did what he told her to do, she would not have to go for a ride. He also included a poem. So Ruth calls Lieutenant Drowatsky and tells him about the letter. This time, the lieutenant wanted Ruth to not open any more letters. He wanted Ed, her husband, to take the letters straight to him so that he could send it off to the lab for prints. And then what they would do is they would copy the letter and give it to Ruth. With each letter, though, the writing was getting more and more illegible. So Ruth would make notations in the margins, making it easier for the lieutenant to read them. And then she would start typing them up with her corrections, so it made it easier for the lieutenant to read them. Throughout that summer and fall, Ruth was continuing to get phone calls, and then they suddenly stopped in October. And Ruth also hadn't been approached since that last incident. Ruth and Ed were just starting to believe that maybe this person had moved on to somebody else. But then, 1 month later in November, Ruth went missing. It was November 21st, and Ruth was on her lunch break. She had just bought a birthday card for a friend when a Chevy Bel Air pulled up to the curb, and the guy that had approached her the other 2 times jumped out, and he asks Ruth if she has his money. He pushed her into the back seat of the car, and he hopped in beside her. There was another man driving. The back seat was filled with stones, rags, some farm equipment, and the door handle on Ruth's side was broken. The man told her to give him her purse, and when she did, he found Lieutenant Drowatsky's business card, and he picked up a small piece of concrete and whacked Ruth in the head with it. Ruth told the man that she needed to go to the bathroom, and after the 2 guys bickered back and forth with one another, they pull into a small park, and they tell Ruth to give them her sweater and her shoes in order to prevent her from running. As soon as Ruth was out of the car, she ran barefoot until she saw a bush, and she hid behind it. She was there for 4 hours, so she was pretty sure that one of the men was close by, so she continued hiding until she thought it was safe. And when she thought it was safe, she ran across the street to a liquor store, and she runs in there, and she asks the store's owner to call the police, and she also gave him Ed's phone number and asked him to call her husband as well. The owner calls the police, and then he calls Ed, but when the owner asked if he was speaking with Ed Finley, Ed thought that he was speaking to one of the people who had kidnapped Ruth. The owner explained that Ruth had given him his number to call him, and he hands Ruth the phone, and Ruth starts explaining that it was the liquor store owner. But even still, Ed was not convinced. He thought that it was possible that Ruth was being told what to say by the people who kidnapped her. So Ed asked Ruth's sister Jean and Jean's husband Bill to go with him to the liquor store to go get Ruth. Earlier in the day, when Ruth did not come back from her lunch break, Ruth's boss called Jean, that's Ruth's sister. Jean was also an employee for the same company as Ruth, and the boss asks her if she knew where Ruth was. So Jean called Ed, and she let him know that Ruth was missing. Prior to this, Ed and Ruth had never told anybody about what was happening except for the police. So Ed told Jean all about the letters, phone calls, and harassment at this point. About 20 minutes later, Ed, Jean, and her husband got to the liquor store, and they were told that the police had already taken Ruth to the station. When they got to the police station, Ruth was sitting in a chair in the corner, and Ed could tell that she had been crying. She was holding onto her purse, and she was clutching onto her can of mace, which was in her purse. So police gathered up what they had taken from Ruth, and it was determined that the kidnappers had taken her paycheck and some saving bonds. Also missing was some letterhead stationery from the phone company. Lieutenant Drowatsky did not want to scare Ed, but he did start to think that it was a possibility that it was the BTK that was harassing Ruth. The next day, investigators went with Ruth to the park where she ran from the people who kidnapped her, and they found Ruth's sweater and shoes, and they only found Ruth's footprints. They also ran a check on every Chevy model that matched Ruth's recollection of the car, but none of the cars led to a suspect. Another thing detectives did was to set up surveillance on Ruth while she window shopped during her lunch break. They also drove Ruth and Ed to Fort Scott in order to conduct a background investigation of the assault on Ruth when she was a teenager. Nothing turned up from these efforts either. During all of this time, Ruth was suffering from terrible headaches and stomach issues. However, she never consulted a doctor because she believed that asking for assistance was equal to, I guess, being weak, which was another lesson from her childhood. Ruth also believed that a proper life meant never becoming an object of gossip, and she worried that her friends would hear about her situation. So she was really embarrassed when letters from her tormentor began to appear throughout Wichita. Initially, they were addressed to the police. Lieutenant Drowatsky received his first note, which accused him of protecting a whore from death. Lieutenant Drowatsky was beyond furious. He had grown to really like Ruth and truly admired her kindness and patience. Police decided at this time they were going to deputize Ed. They showed Ed how to clear a house properly, and they taught him how to shoot from the police stance. They told him to aim for the stomach because a person shot in the stomach will always bend over, and if that person manages to shoot off a round, that the worst thing that could happen is being shot in the foot. With all this, Ruth and Ed developed a new routine. They no longer went to the basement to watch TV together. Ruth now stayed inside alone, while Ed took a 12-gauge shotgun and a revolver to the backyard, hiding in the bushes, waiting. As Ruth had feared, her friends who had heard about what was happening had jumped ship. She had only one really good friend who supported her and never felt like it was too much to handle. But also Ruth and Ed became really good friends with Lieutenant Drowatsky and his wife, Dora Ann. They had a lot in common, and they really enjoyed being together, with Lieutenant Drowatsky and his wife even joining the same church as Ruth and Ed. In August, Ruth and Ed were preparing for an annual trip they took to Colorado every summer. Ruth decided that she needed a new pair of jeans for the trip, and she told Ed she was going to run over to the mall to get a few things for their trip. The letters and calls were coming in less by this time, and Ruth was trying to not let the fear that she felt dictate her every move. She felt she could run to the mall real quick and be back without any real kind of issue. But she was wrong. When she left the mall to go to her car in the parking lot, she was just about to open her car door when a hand clamped down on her, and when she looked up, it was the same man who had kidnapped her 1 year earlier. Ruth pushed him away, but the man threw a brown paper bag into her back seat from a window that was rolled partway down, and he took out a boning knife and stabbed Ruth 3 times in the back. Even after being stabbed, Ruth managed to break free from this man, and she was able to hop into her car, and she rolled up the window, trapping the man's right hand glove in the window. She drove out of the lot with the glove in the window and the knife sticking in her side. She was in excruciating pain and felt like she was about to pass out, so she sees a payphone outside of a gas station, and she crossed 3 lanes to get there. She got out of the car and dialed the police. Lieutenant Drowatsky was off duty, but she was able to get his captain, who told her to stay there after she told him what happened. But Ruth said she was too afraid to be there out in the open, and she told him she was going to drive home. The captain called Ed and told him to be expecting Ruth and to take her to the emergency room the second she gets there. Ruth started driving home, and she was so terrified that every male driver she saw, she thought was her attacker. She was losing more and more blood, and she ended up taking a wrong turn before realizing she was on the wrong road, and then she finally finds her street where Ed was waiting, and he helped move Ruth over, and he took off the 4 miles to hospital as Ruth passed out. As soon as Lieutenant Drowatsky got the call at home, he rushed over to the ER where Ruth was lying on her side with the knife still sticking out. When Lieutenant Drowatsky went to go speak to the doctor, the knife fell out of her side onto the floor, and that's when it was realized just how deep the stab wounds were. Ruth was wheeled into surgery, where the doctor told her that the knife came within a fraction of an inch of puncturing her kidney. He told her that had it been any deeper, she would have died. Her surgery was successful, and she was in hospital for another 6 days. That night, Ruth was the lead story on every local newscast. Ruth recovered from her injuries sooner than she was expected, and police gave the okay for her to go home. They gave her a police escort, and they also checked out the house, yard, and neighborhood before she got there. But after Ruth had only been home for a few minutes, Lieutenant Drowatsky told Ruth and Ed that Ruth needs to get out of there because he was just told by a nurse at hospital that a man matching the description of Ruth's attacker had come into hospital looking for her. So Ruth goes to her sister's house for a couple of days, and Lieutenant Drowatsky watched her house for 2 days, just waiting for this man to show up, but he never does. After processing Ruth's car for evidence, they found the brown paper bag the man had thrown in the car. It contained rope, tape, cloth, a newspaper clipping about Lieutenant Drowatsky, and a bottle of cheap wine. There were also no usable fingerprints found. About 1 month after Ruth and Ed came back from their vacation, Ed decided he would try to talk to His poems are how he communicated with Ruth in his writings to her and the police. Eventually, in the press and on TV, this man was being referred to as the poet. So now, deemed as the poet, this man was writing letters and communicating so frequently with Ruth and the police that the coverage was more than the coverage that BTK was getting at the time. There were hundreds of tips coming in, and a composite sketch was done, which brought in a ton of sightings. So now, here is when things in this case start to turn the tides. In early 1980, Lieutenant Drowatsky was promoted to the Vice and Organized Crime Unit, and a new captain was assigned to oversee Ruth's case. His name was Captain Mike Hill, so I'll be referring to him as Captain Hill throughout. Now, Captain Hill read over Ruth's entire case, and Lieutenant Drowatsky made sure there are no details left out. Captain Hill was an extremely meticulous investigator, and he went through every scenario in his head as to who could be doing all of this to Ruth. He decided that having Ruth and Ed so involved in the investigation needed to stop. He didn't want them in the loop, so to speak. He thought it to be a conflict of interest to have Ruth and Ed being told what steps investigators were taking and what new evidence they find. He did not want information shared with Ruth and Ed. He felt it was his responsibility to find out who was doing this and not to become friends with Ruth and Ed. And when Captain Hill told the Finleys that they would no longer be privy to or part of the investigation, it really made Ed upset. And so Ed went and complained to the chief of police, but the chief told them that there was nothing he could do about it. Captain Hill was in charge, and what Hill says goes. Then the chief went and told Captain Hill what Ed complained about, and from there, Captain Hill and the Finleys did not get along. There was a mutual disdain between Ed and Captain Hill. Within a few days of taking the case, Captain Hill received a letter from the poet. It was a poem pretty much taunting Captain Hill, telling him that he will never find him. And then after that, the Finleys' phone line was cut. Captain Hill amped up the investigation by assigning around-the-clock detectives in the Finleys' home. They would take 12-hour shifts, and the Finleys were hardly ever alone. Also, there was 24 surveillance on the home inside and outside, with cameras being watched live. Ruth baked pies and cakes, and all of the detectives became really close to Ruth, including one in particular named Mark, who noticed that whenever they spoke about the poet, Ruth would get headaches and she would have to go lie down. But what he found really odd was that Ruth would oftentimes excuse herself to go wash her hair. A few weeks later, Ruth got a call while she was at work, telling her that the poet has something waiting for her in the lobby in the phone booth. It turned out to be a butcher knife wrapped in a red bandana. 2 weeks after that, on Valentine's Day, Ruth got another poem in the mail, and this time there was like a piece of a red bandana that was tied by some twine that was inside the envelope. One day in February, a florist shop receives a $5 bill and a note asking them to send Ruth one black flower and a poem he wanted attached. Then, a couple of weeks later, Lieutenant Drowatsky and Captain Hill secretive, suspicious, and seclusive. There was also another composite sketch that was shown. The conference got major coverage, and on July 4th, 1980, Ruth's story was covered in the National Enquirer. I don't know about that. And the letters from the poet kept coming. Ruth's bank got a call asking for all of her money to be transferred to another bank. The motor vehicle department was asked to confiscate Ruth's license due to her bad driving. A key-making company received a request for a new set of keys to Ruth's front door, and then a letter was received by a construction company to leave a load of dirt in Ruth's driveway. The health department got a letter stating that Ruth was spreading a venereal disease. A mortuary company was asked to contact Ruth, saying that Ruth will be in need of their services soon. Letters were sent to the electric and gas companies asking to terminate services at Ruth's home, and a motor vehicle repair shop was instructed to take the Finley's pickup into its shop to replace the engine. In 5 months, the poet had mailed 50 letters, including one to Captain Hill, telling him that the police are helping a bitch, and he's not going away, and that he has a tidal wave of demons in his soul. In response to all of this, Captain Hill came up with some new ideas. A still camera that was camouflaged in the Finley's birdhouse. Its shutter rigged to trip if someone tampered with the phone wires, but no one did. Vice and narcotics officers were assigned to look through other envelopes that were received by the Kansas Gas and Electric companies for handwriting similar to the poet's, but they found nothing. The letters were sent to a consultant who had worked on the Son of Sam case, and after examining them, the consultant sent back a psychological profile of the poet, saying that he was severely psychotic, schizophrenic, pathologically paranoid, a loner with a deep feeling of persecution. But this was something the police already knew. The letters were also given to the Wichita Criminalistics Lab for handwriting analysis, but the results were inconclusive, and the FBI's examination to see if the poet's handwriting matched Ed's was negative. Also, a chemical test for saliva on the envelopes to look for a blood type was unproductive. 1 month and a half later, at 6:30 in the morning, while Ed was asleep, Ruth got out of bed to check the house. She did not see anything, but when she went to check the front porch, she saw a glass bottle filled with yellow liquid. When Ruth picked it up and smelled it, it was urine. Following that incident, there were more to come. There was a broken lock, a van that was on their street going back and forth at really odd hours, and a Molotov cocktail found on Ruth's front porch. A few days before Christmas, Ruth and Ed were watching TV in their basement, and they heard a loud crash. Ed ran upstairs just in time to see the Christmas wreath on fire. The noise they heard was the window cracking from the heat. 1 week later, another poem showed up, and I'm going to read to you what the poem said. Once upon the night so dreary, premonitions of a disaster keep you weary. The whore bore her guilt in her bed of slime, from selling her ass and not charging a dime. Slept with strangers in evil bed. Enraged demon hunters saw blood was red. All bitches should keep their names and faces secret. Defenseless instincts released with demonic sluts' threats. Blurred vision and suffering, an accuser's cage. umbilical cord connected by seed and range. In February, Ruth found a rock wrapped in the poet's favorite red bandana cloth in her backyard. In April, it was a pair of wire cutters and more bandana material soaked in flammable chemicals. A Molotov cocktail without the bottle with a poem attached, which said, "Hickory dickory dock, your face mounted on my clock, eyes at 10 and 2, hands to knife for you, hickory dick dock." One morning, 2 months later, Ed went to grab the newspaper on the front porch, and lying next to it was a dirty envelope. When he picked it up, it was a gift from the poet, and the envelope was filled with feces. On Friday, September 4th, one day before Labor Day weekend, Lieutenant Drowatsky walked into the chief of police office to tell him there was a new development in the case. The poet sent another letter, only this time targeting the police of chief's wife, Sharon, saying that after taking care of Ruth, he's coming after Sharon. The letter contained personal information about Sharon, like the make and model of her car and which route she took to drive to work. Now this prompted the chief to get involved, of course, and that night he got together all of the files, which were 15 large 3-ring binders, and he brought them all home. Over the long weekend, the chief read every file over and over. He dissected every poem, article, and report, and by that Sunday morning, he had solved the case. Now, 2 days later, the chief gathers 16 officers in the basement of the courthouse for a meeting, where he tells them that Ruth Finley herself was the poet. Before any of his men could say anything, he began listing his reasons why he believed this. Number 1. There had never been a single witness to any of Ruth's encounters with the poet, though they all occurred in public places. Number 2. The Finleys lived on a dead-end street with little traffic, yet none of the neighbors or stationed police officers had ever spotted the poet, nor were any footprints ever discovered. 3. Detectives found only a single set of footprints, which were Ruth's, in the park where she had supposedly ran to after being kidnapped. She also said her kidnapper had struck her in the face with concrete, but her face showed no injury. Number 4. Ruth called the Central Investigations Office in the police department when she was stabbed. Why not emergency dispatchers? And she got out of the car to make the call, then back in the car to drive home. How could she do that with a knife in her back? Number 5. Captain Hill received a letter from the poet as soon as he took over Ruth's case, but only Ruth, Ed, and police knew Captain Hill had assumed command. Number 6. As soon as the recording camera was placed in the birdhouse, a camera of which only the Finleys and the police were aware, the poet stopped appearing in Ruth and Ed's backyard. Number 7. The poet's messages to Ed in the Eagle Beacon's classified section stopped whenever the Finleys were on vacation and resumed as soon as they returned. So the police chief, his name is Richard LeMunyon. I'll be referring to him as Chief LeMunyon. So Chief LeMunyon told his officers that Ruth was the only suspect who made sense, unless it is Ed, which he did not believe that it was. The chief felt that it was his lack of a personal relationship with Ruth that gave him the emotional distance to be able to identify Ruth as the suspect. He felt that the friendship suspect of such outrageous behavior. The question of whether Ruth was genuinely crazy or just conniving remained to be answered. During the 3-hour meeting, Chief LeMunyon told his officers they would spend the next 2 weeks doing around-the-clock surveillance on the Finleys, and that narcotics and vice officers would be providing additional support. The officers would work 12-hour shifts with a van parked in a shopping center 2 blocks from the Finleys' house. That would serve as the command center. The chief also warned his men not to breathe a word of the surveillance to anyone, including their spouses, telling them that if the media received any tips, he would fire every person in the room. Now, as you can imagine, detectives were incredibly stunned by the news that Ruth might be the poet, but they did keep their feelings in check. Lieutenant Drowatsky, in particular, was devastated because of how close he and his wife had grown with the Finleys. Privately, many of them thought that Chief LeMunyon was deluded because there were doctors, psychologists, linguists, and a whole host of other professionals whom all said that Ruth and the poet could not be the same person, that they were 2 distinctly different people. But Chief LeMunyon did not believe any of the experts or doctors who said Ruth could not have done this, because in his experience, doctors constantly underestimate the human potential for self-destruction. He stood firm. He did not believe anything Ruth said. He thought that Ruth had not been stabbed in the parking lot at all, and that she had stabbed herself on the way home after calling for help that day. The police chief was convinced that he, rather than his men, had solved the case because he had never met Ruth Finley. But for procedure's sake, he asked Ruth's doctor if he believed that Ruth could have been involved in any of the poet's activities, and the doctor remained insistent that Ruth and the poet could not be the same person. Chief LeMunyon went further, giving the medical reports to his own doctor to see what he thought, and he too said there was no way Ruth could have inflicted the wounds on herself. But even with all this, the chief believed that the incident when Ruth was a teenager and was assaulted in Fort Bragg never happened, at least not in the way Ruth said it did. He firmly believed that Ruth was not the normal woman she appeared, but was actually quite demented. He refused to meet her or even talk with her on the phone. He felt like Ruth was like a mythological beast, that after anybody who spent just a few minutes with Ruth believed everything she said, and the truth seemed to disappear. On Monday, September 14th, the surveillance of Ruth and Ed began. For the next 2 weeks, the police would document the Finleys' every move. At least 1 police car and 1 helicopter would follow them at all times. Inside the command center van at East Gate Mall, 2 officers watched through a camera with a long-range lens. The lens was trained on the mailboxes just opposite their vehicle. Chief LeMunyon was going to be away with his wife in New Orleans for a police convention, so he appointed a detective to lead the investigation until he came back. 3 days later, the police helicopter caught something. At 8:30 a.m., Ed drove into the Eastgate Mall parking lot and stopped at a mailbox. Ruth reached out the passenger side window and dropped some mail in the slot, and Ed drove off. The helicopter pilot had no idea what he had just witnessed, because his instructions had specified only that he should follow the Finley's car at all times. But he notified officers nonetheless. At 1:30 p.m., which was 30 minutes before the mail was to be picked up, a postal inspector who was called by police opened the mailbox and took out what was in there. He took the personal letter from the Finleys, 2 were bill payments from the Finleys, and 2 were letters from the poet, one addressed to Ruth and one to a local TV station reading, "Hickory Dickory Dock. The name on this face is Smock. Heat the iron for the brand. Cooperate for games planned. Hickory Dickory Dock." Even though police had witnessed Ruth dropping letters in the mailbox, and there were letters from the poet in the mailbox as well, that was in no way irrefutable proof, because it was possible that somebody had come along after them and mailed those letters. Several days later, the Finleys again went to the Eastgate Mall mailbox at 4:15 p.m. Detectives took color photographs as Ruth's arm extended out of the passenger window and dropped letters in the slot. As soon as Ed drove away, an undercover police car pulled in front of the mailbox to block anyone else from getting to it, and detectives opened the hood of the car so it would look like the reason the car was there was because it was having engine trouble. The postal inspector was again called out to process the mail once more. From that collection of mail, 4 letters from the Finleys were grouped together on top of the pile. There was a utility company bill, a payment to JCPenney's, a personal letter, and a poet letter addressed to Ruth, and this one read, "No dumbass bitch will get the fucking law to get me." When the detectives had finished, the Postal Service resealed the envelopes and delivered the letters to Ruth and Ed. The 2 bills were sent to where they were supposed to go, and then police retrieved them in order to establish a chain of evidence. The next morning, the Finleys found the poet letter, and Ed, just as he had done all along, brought it to the police. So from here, things went quickly. Detectives rushed to the post office, and they poured through thousands of envelopes at the businesses that the Finleys had mailed their payments to. They were looking for a match with Ruth's handwriting. Police also swarmed the drop box that was located in the lobby of where Ruth worked at Southwestern Bell, where several poet letters were recovered from the box. That same day, detectives searched Ruth's office at the phone company. They discovered a book of poetry, a sheet of torn carbon paper with the poet's handwriting, and a red bandana, which is one of the poet's trademarks, wrapped in a used yellow Kleenex in Ruth's desk. They also found torn pieces of Big Chief paper covered with the poet's writing in the trash. 3 days later, the police began the process of obtaining search warrants for the Finleys' house. Although the police were now certain that Ruth was the poet, there was still no physical evidence to tie her to the letters. That evidence would be needed if any charges were to be filed. Chief LeMunion and his wife Sharon returned from the police convention in New Orleans a couple of days later to find another letter from the poet waiting for Sharon in their mailbox. The letter had been mailed from Southwestern Bell on Friday, one day before police began monitoring the mailbox in the company's lobby. The lower half of the page was torn. The next day, microscopic fracture analysis proved that the bottom of the letter perfectly matched a ripped piece of paper found in Ruth's trash. Analysis also showed that the stamps on the envelopes retrieved from the businesses where Ruth and Ed sent their bills came from the same cardboard container as the stamp on the poet's recent letter to Ruth. The investigation was complete. The only remaining question was whether Ed Finley had been involved. On October 1st, Police had always returned the poet's letters to the Finleys. Ed was taken to an office in the Special Investigation section where they interviewed Ed. They asked Ed to detail his early years, his childhood, his family, his career as an accountant, and Ed's answers were truthful and concise. They then wanted to know details beginning with Ed's stay in the hospital in 1977 up until the poet's most recent letter. Detectives felt confident that Ed had been entirely unaware of Ruth's activities. 2 hours into the interview, Captain Hill told Ed they knew who the poet is, and Ed could not wait to hear who it was, and at the same time was elated that all of this was finally coming to an end. Captain Hill shows Ed pictures of Ruth mailing letters from the Eastgate Mall and told them that one of the letters is a letter from the poet, also telling Ed that he can verify that Ruth had mailed 5 poet letters in the last 2 weeks. Ed sat there stunned. All he could say over and over was, "Oh my God, oh my God." Captain Hill told Ed that the police were not mad at Ruth. They simply wanted to make sure that she received the help she so clearly needed. But he also told Ed that they needed to eliminate him as being the poet or knowing about it by giving him a polygraph test, to which Ed agreed. The test took about 1 hour and Ed easily passed. With the polygraph complete, a group of detectives went with Ed to the Finley's house, where they discovered some more items tied to the poet. They found a book of poems titled Maniac and Other Poems. They found pencils, pens, letters, carbon paper, a roller guide, a writing tablet, and pieces of red bandana. That same afternoon at 5 p.m., Lieutenant Drowatsky went to Ruth's workplace and met her in the lobby, where he asked her to come to the station with him so that she could look at some mugshots, and Ruth agreed to do so. Once at the station, Lieutenant Drowatsky brought Ruth into the same room that her husband had been in just a few hours prior. Captain Hill was waiting for her, and once she saw him, he asked her to sit down, and he asked Ruth, just as he had asked her husband Ed, to give him details of her life, all the way back to her childhood, up until the point of the poet making an appearance in her life. After Ruth had finished detailing her life, Captain Hill put a pile of letters written by the poet on the table in front of her. He asked Ruth if she had written any of these letters, and Ruth said she had not. But that wasn't good enough for Captain Hill. He then showed her the video surveillance and asked her again. It was at this time that an image appeared in Ruth's mind. It was an image of her sitting in her basement writing a letter. The image was only a fragment, not a full memory. She wasn't even sure if it was real or not. Captain Hill listed the items that police had found from her office wastebasket. He asked her, "Ruthie, why? It's time. It's time to tell me why. I'm not mad at you, Ruth. I want you to know. I want to know why you are doing this." So one thing to remember here is that Captain Hill, even though he and Ed didn't really get along, just like so many other of the detectives and officers working on this case, felt very protective of Ruth. They all saw Ruth as a woman who was sweet and kind, and some of these men even saw Ruth almost like a mother figure. So this was all incredibly difficult to reconcile, especially Lieutenant Drowatsky. If you remember, Lieutenant Drowatsky and his wife had become incredibly close with Ruth and Ed, and they would often have dinner with them and, go to many many different places with them as couples together, even church. So, right here, Captain Hill, in a sense, interrogating Ruth was breaking his heart. He continued asking Ruth why, and she continued saying she didn't know. She kept getting flashes and glimpses of different things. One thing in particular was a red bandana in her hand, and she could not understand why. Captain Hill asked Ruth, "Why did you make up a story about the abduction, sweetheart? Why did you do it? Why did you stab yourself?" And Ruth, crying, told him, "I don't know." Captain Hill asked about the assault in Fort Scott when she was 16 years old, when that man had branded her legs. He wanted to know, had she made that up too? And Ruth insisted that attack had been real. Captain Hill assured Ruth that she was not a criminal and that he wasn't mad at her. He just wanted an explanation, but Ruth said she didn't have one. As Captain Hill continued his questioning, Ruth admitted she had written the poet's letters, that she had placed the butcher knife in her office's lobby phone booth, that she had left the urine and feces on her porch, that she had siphoned gas for Molotov cocktails from her car. She said that on the day of her supposed kidnapping, she had taken a bus and then walked to the river to leave her sweater and shoes for the police to find. But even as she was recounting these details, Ruth wasn't sure they were real. She was telling Captain Hill the most logical possibilities. She had no memory of the acts she was describing. The only thing she knew for sure was that she had done horrible things because Captain Hill was telling her she did. She said she stabbed herself in her car that night, and when Captain Hill asked her if she meant to hurt herself as badly as she had, she said that she didn't know. She also didn't know what was going through her mind when she wrote the poet letters, and she didn't know how long it took her to write them. The only memories she had felt like they belonged to someone else. Captain Hill said, "You only have a disease, just like any other disease in the body." Captain Hill went to get the psychologist that Ruth had been seeing for the past 2 years in order to deal with being stalked, harassed, and abducted by the poet. The psychologist walks in and asks Ruth, "What would you like to do now?" And Ruth answered she wanted to go home and die. At 9 p.m. that night, Ruth was put in a squad car with Ed beside her, and she was taken to St. Joseph's Hospital, and she was placed under a 24-hour-a-day psychiatric watch. In the meantime, authorities were deciding whether to press charges. The case of the poet had cost the police department close to $400,000, and while some detectives were sympathetic to Ruth's psychological struggles, others, such as Chief LeMunyon, thought she was a criminal and wanted to punish her. But after reviewing Ruth's psychological report, the district attorney announced he would not be pursuing criminal prosecution because her actions as the poet were not malicious. In October of 1981, Ruth gave her first public statement since confessing to the police, saying, "I think I may have died and gone to hell. I think I'm coming back, though." 7 days later, Ruth entered twice-a-week therapy with Dr. Andrew Pickens, a 38-year-old graduate of St. Louis University Medical School, who was a practitioner of psychoanalysis. Dr. Pickens viewed the role of the psychiatrist as that of a detective because both searched for clues, for hidden pieces of a puzzle which would solve a larger mystery, whether psychological or criminal. Under Dr. Pickens' care, Ruth began the painful process of excavating her Depression-era childhood on a farm in rural Richards, Missouri. part of her therapy, Ruth composed lengthy poems, which she initially found a more comfortable way for expressing her emotions than speaking about them face to face. At first, Ruth told Dr. Pickens that her childhood had been impoverished, but normal. And yet, the poems she wrote about those years were filled with images of violence. She kept having visions of a red bandana, which for unknown reasons filled her with revulsion. After 3 months of repeated attempts, Ruth and Dr. Pickens uncovered the source of Ruth's terror. When Ruth was a girl, an adult neighbor and family friend had used a red bandana to tie her up. Later, he took her to his barn and shoved the bandana in her mouth as he sexually assaulted her. The neighbor continued abusing Ruth for almost a year, producing in Ruth enormous feelings of guilt. Her parents punished her whenever she ran away or cried during the man's visit to the farm. Ruth grew convinced the abuse was her fault, that she was evil at heart and that she had deserved it. The man threatened to kill her if she told anyone about their secret. During the assaults, Ruth dealt with her horror, as she put it, by floating off to heaven. She could see what was happening to the girl down below, but somehow it wasn't so bad if it wasn't her, if she was just watching it. So this is a common occurrence among victims of childhood trauma, which is clinically known as dissociative disorder. Sufferers experience a disconnect between their identity, consciousness, actions, and surroundings. The dissociative state allows them to escape reality, to hold the traumatic experiences at bay. Ruth had kept the memories of her childhood abuse buried for 43 years, until Dr. Pickens believed the stress of Ed's hospitalization for a possible heart attack and the fact that the BTK strangler had forced her repressed trauma to the surface. The branding attack in Fort Scott, Ruth always maintained, had been real as well, which was backed up by her brother Carl. Ruth had dealt with the emotional deluge by creating another self, the poet. It was not split personality disorder. The poet was not a fully developed personality, nor an entirely separate identity, but an alternate consciousness, one Ruth had no memory or awareness of when in a regular conscious mind. It's super important to realize that the dissociative state and what Ruth did, which is a dissociative state, but it is not the same thing as multiple personality disorder. They're two different things. Ruth spent the next 7 years in intensive therapy with Dr. Pickens, slowly working through the torment of her childhood. During these raw, emotionally devastating years, Ed stuck fiercely by Ruth, as did her children and siblings. Though Ruth lost some friends, many others expressed only sympathy for her, feeling badly that she had suffered. But Chief LeMunyon remained doubtful, saying, "I think she's lying." He said she knew everything she was doing. Maybe something happened in her childhood, but not what she says. Eventually, Ruth felt healed enough to allow her story to be told by a local news station, hoping it would help other survivors. Her hope was well placed. The outpouring from viewers was overwhelmingly positive, erasing for Ruth the lingering disgrace that she felt for her actions as the poet. She had, with a lot of effort and after years of struggle, triumphed over her abuse and achieved the stability she was seeking. Her story had a happy ending, and she never wrote poetry.